Welcome to Verified RX, your prescription for success. Brought to you by the Vizient Center for Pharmacy Practice Excellence.
Baxter's Intravenous Fluids North Cove plant was impacted in September by Hurricane Helene. Although Baxter implemented a hurricane preparedness plan, a levee breach and bridge collapse forced a complete shutdown. Intravenous fluids are now on allocation as the plant remains shuttered. Multiple actions by the FDA and Baxter are in effect to improve supply for these fluids. Two Vizient colleagues, Katie Korte and Hoelting, joined me for this episode to discuss lessons learned from this and past supply disruptions, ongoing efforts by the FDA to improve supplies, and the supply outlook for the next 4 to 8 weeks. I'm Stacy Lauderdale, Associate Vice President of Evidence-Based Medicine and your Verified RX program host. Kyle and Katie, it's great to have you back on the Verified RX podcast. Why don't you both reintroduce yourself to our listeners?
My name is Kyle Hoelting, Senior Clinical Manager of Drug Information and Shortages, and I lead our member drug shortage mitigation group and our internal shortage surveillance and readiness team with Vizient Center for Pharmacy Practice Excellence.
And hi, my name is Katie Korte, and I am the VP of our Assurance and Continuity team here at Vizient, leading our assurance strategies and solutions across all of the categories.
We're here today to talk about the current IV fluid shortages, but I have been a pharmacist long enough that there's been a lot of similar supply challenges in recent years. I recently read a post on X that asked, why do we never learn from these supply disruptions? And I thought that was a great question. Walk me through recent supply disruptions. Are they all the same or maybe there's some differences?
That's a great question, Stacy, because if we don't take a moment to look back and reflect on what we've learned, we would really miss opportunities as we look forward and look at how we're going to support both our supply chain and our providers. I have to think about Hurricane Maria and COVID as two significant occurrences that happened, and I was at the hospital at the times when these events happened. If we take a look at these two events and the breakdown of our supply chain and how we got into the scenarios we got into, Hurricane Maria hit in September of 2017. For our listeners who weren't as familiar with that event, that also hit a Baxter manufacturing plant located in Puerto Rico. Primarily coming out of that plant was mini bag manufacturing and mini bag plus manufacturing. I can recall being at the bedside at that point in my career as a trauma ICU pharmacist and having to tell providers that I couldn't give them their medications in the form that they preferred because we had no supply on hand of those mini bags. That's one event that happened where so much manufacturing was happening at one manufacturing plant. When Hurricane Maria came through and production went down, we saw that impact across the United States. But the great thing with that event was that they also had large volume parenterals that they were able to substitute or provide as support to providers as they got through that event. Now, they were able to get back up in manufacturing in early 2018. And with that backup supply, it felt a little bit less significant than what we're seeing today. Now, with COVID, what we saw was a variety of factors that played into those disruptions. Things like lockdowns in other countries. As you look at where we are manufacturing and importing products from, when those lockdowns happened, we saw a significant decrease of product coming into the United States. But also think about the teams of people that it takes to work the manufacturing plants and produce the product. If countries were going on quarantine, we were unable to bring that product into the United States. Supply was significantly decreased during that time, but also the patient volumes. These hurricane instances that we're seeing is causing a supply constraint from a production standpoint. But in COVID, we also saw patient surging happening at all the hospitals. Census was significantly up. Demand was outpacing supply. There's a couple of different core reasons that we can point out as to where breakdowns in our supply chain happen through these different events. But in general, there's a lot of lessons learned through those events, both on the hospital side and for our suppliers.
Thanks, Katie. Your answer was really insightful, which as practitioners, we need to realize every supply disruption is unique and the causes are unique and perhaps the confounding factors may also be unique. It's maybe not one size fits all from a supply disruption standpoint. I'm wondering, Kyle, you can answer this question. While there may be differences or what caused recent supply disruptions, are we able or did we learn any lessons and can we apply those lessons to this current shortage?
There's several lessons. I would start on the supplier side of things. Over the last several years, the focus has been on resiliency and redundancy. And you do see that implementation of those practices, specifically with Baxter in this instance. They had separate plants in Mexico and Spain that were able to step in, create product, and get that shipped over to the US. Outside of Baxter, other suppliers, when these natural disasters do occur, now have protocols, plans, and communication strategies in place ahead of time. Often inventory is moved out of areas of significant concern or the paths of these storms. Throughout the industry, resiliency, redundancy, mitigating and managing these natural disasters has certainly been a focus in the last 5 years or so.
That's great to hear. One of the other comments that I've heard is, why didn't we learn to enhance redundancy? And it sounds like we did learn that, and there is redundancy. Have we learned anything from a provider standpoint from these shortages? It's great that the manufacturers have enhanced the redundancy. Have we as providers learned anything from these shortages?
That's a great point and gets to the relationship of supply and demand. For providers, we first experienced Hurricane Maria. We dealt with this, not exactly the same scenario, but with fluids. We then experienced the pandemic. This highlighted a lot of our strategies and plans within our health systems to manage and mitigate shortages at a large scale. These are shortages that don't affect one service line, one patient population. They affected the entirety of the hospitals, the health systems, and the majority of the patients that we treat. We've seen in the last several years a focus on multidisciplinary drug shortage committees, having the appropriate stakeholders at the table when they're needed. And some institutions are focused on dedicated roles, whether that be a drug shortage pharmacist, a specific buyer who helps manage drug shortages, or a team of multiple individuals to help tackle these types of issues. As our providers on the front lines have been learning and the suppliers have been learning, we at Vizient have been learning as well. Over the last several years, 2 teams or committees, I'll say. The first being our shortage surveillance and readiness team. This is a pharmacy-centric group that focuses on surveillance, communication, and action specific to drug shortages, so our members are better equipped to mitigate and manage any issues or supply constraints that may come their way. I'll turn it over to Katie for this portion, but the supply assurance team and the command centers have really become the foundation of a lot of our work for supply assurance within Vizient.
Many of our hospital providers, for example, through this event with Baxter, have stood up a command center. They have a centralized functioning team looking at the entire operations of their hospital, how they're doing supply conservation, the resources that they're leveraging to ensure that can be put into place. And we're doing the same exact thing here at Vizient. Kyle, you're talking about the SSRT team and the supply assurance team. And so lessons that we learned here is strength in numbers. We have such knowledgeable and talented team members who have such a variety of backgrounds and expertise that for us to bring that together in one command center structure has been absolutely vital to our ability to assess what's going on with the event, communicate appropriately to our hospital providers, and make sure that we're putting the right resources and recommendations into place. Really what that looks like is for the listeners to understand, it's putting a command center together where you've got expertise like what Kyle's bringing to the table from pharmacy. We've got our medical surgical category experts and leaders at the table. We have marketing, communications, legal, government relations to advocate and work with the FDA. So we're pulling together every single key stakeholder that can help us move through this event smoothly and quickly. You see that on the provider side as well, when you're standing up command centers and really trying to work through in a time of either crisis or a catastrophic event. We've certainly learned and very proud of the work that we're doing and how we've been able to move through this and support providers in a time of need.
Thank you for that, Katie and Kyle. And I was at Vizient during the COVID shortages, still at Vizient during the Hurricane Helene effort, and absolutely would affirm how well organized this command center is. I hear that we've had lessons learned from the suppliers. Our providers have stood up command centers. They're focusing on conservation efforts. But I'm starting to see headlines about elective surgeries being canceled. And it feels like, to some, that this fluid shortage is getting worse. One of the things that happens when things get worse is we direct our attention to the FDA. And I'm starting to hear people ask, what is the FDA doing to assist with this shortage?
They've been highly involved since the moment that the Baxter North Cove facility was impacted by Hurricane Helene. They have been in regular communication with Baxter, alternate suppliers, and doing everything on their end to assess and act as quickly as possible. The FDA first step is assessing whether or not there is a true drug shortage occurring. The FDA had several of the fluids that were impacted by the Baxter North Cove facility already on their drug shortage list. They added several after their assessment of the market and the impact of the temporary pause in production at the Baxter facility. Once the FDA notes a medication as on shortage, it opens up several different paths for the FDA to work through. Several things occur. The first being potential lifting of compounding restrictions. It's important to note that if there is an FDA-approved product that's available in the market, it cannot be compounded by an outsourcing facility unless it is noted as on drug shortage via FDA. The second thing they can do is extend the expiration dates of products. Now, there's been confusion as to who directs this process, but the way that this pathway works is the suppliers themselves will submit stability data to FDA. The FDA then assesses that data, and they will determine whether there is the ability to extend the duration of products past their expiration date. That process is happening in the background today. That's why you'll see a lot of recommendations to quarantine recently expired products. So more to come on that. We're all awaiting potential information, but more to come. The third thing that they can do is allow temporary importation of products that are approved internationally. You'll note on, I believe it was October 9th, FDA submitted information about several products that they are working through importation of. They are coming from China, the UK, Ireland, as well as others. That's the threefold actions that FDA can and does do when drugs are noted as on shortage. I do want to end with, for the compounding restrictions, FDA has also released temporary guidance for facilities in compounding these IV fluids. Specifically of note, they've provided beyond use dating of the products as they're compounded. So I want to reference and direct people towards the FDA information that is already out there and can help guide them through these supply constraints. And I want to end with some things that the FDA cannot require a company to do. They cannot disclose the details of why a shortage occurs. They cannot require a company to make a drug, to make more of a drug, and lastly, determine how much and to whom the drug is distributed. That's important context as we move through this supply constraint today.
What I would add to that is Vizient continues to advocate knowing what the FDA can and cannot do. What we can do is to make sure the FDA is informed. So we make sure that the FDA is aware of what we are aware of, where we're seeing issues in the supply chain or where we're seeing a potential shortage coming. That is something that we have greatly focused on, is making sure that our government relations team is informing and advocating to the right parties to make sure that we do see change enacted where we can enact change.
Appreciate these insights. It sounds like the FDA is doing all that it can. It's allowing drug compounding. We'll have to wait and see on extended expiration dating. That sounds like it depends on Baxter. But it also sounds like the FDA is allowing importation. Hopefully, there will be some relief from this shortage in the near future. Katie, can you provide some high-level thoughts on what the trajectory of this shortage may look like over the next 4 to 8 weeks?
I think that's a great question, and one for everyone to absorb and think about that workflow, because we heard announcements a couple of weeks ago about allocations increasing and importation being approved. That doesn't necessarily equate to product being on U.S. soil tomorrow. To truly understand how the supply chain brings product into the United States and how long that can take will help providers as they look long term at the conservation strategies they're putting into place, understanding the scenario that they're going to have to work through here for the next several weeks. Distribution time for product to get through a normal channel can be anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks. If you add the additional factor of importation, the checks that the FDA has to put into place, we're not just talking about the FDA, we're also talking about the Department of Homeland Security and the different transportation partners that are engaging in getting the product to the United States. That adds a lot of time and steps to the process. There's organizations like the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response who have engaged with this specific incident with Baxter to help shorten the typical distribution process, where it could be anywhere from 5 to 10 days, and they're trying to get that to under a day. Just the process of importation can take a couple of weeks. And even with that, it can take time once it hits U.S. soil to then get to the docks of our hospitals. I'll ask Kyle here, as we talk to providers about the amount of time that's going to take to see that product hit their docks, what would you recommend from your viewpoint and the work that you're doing and what you're seeing that they do and they continue to focus on now until we see some relief?
Katie, I think our message stays the same today as it did at the start of this. Act now and communicate. You cannot simply rely on changes to inventory practices, i.e. purchasing more. You need to implement conservation strategies now. If you haven't already, you need to do it today. This will affect the amount of product available to you in the coming weeks as we wait for product to come back into the market. The second piece is communication. This is a supply constraint that affects multiple service lines, the majority of our patients. We need to bring together pharmacy, our supply chain, and those distinct stakeholders that need to be at the table to help make the appropriate decisions. We continue to focus on a drug shortage stewardship mentality, meaning implementing inventory and mitigation practices at the hospital and health system level to allow supply to stabilize at the national level. Currently, there is a scarcity of product on the market. Once more supply arrives into the market, the duration of these shortages can potentially be lessened through the implementation of drug shortage stewardship principles. There are a variety of resources out there today to help you implement conservation strategies, namely being the Vizient IV push list provides multiple medications you can administer via IV push to save IV fluids. We also have a fluid conservation strategy document. Both of these are available to the public. Secondly, I'd recommend folks take a look at ASHP's small and large volume fluid conservation strategy document. It holds a wealth of information. There are several things within there that you may not have thought of that you could consider today, and that's what needs to be done today. Consider those unknowns, understand how to move forward. Additionally, there are several other organizations that have provided guidelines or resources to help folks through this temporary supply constraint. We'll list those out in the show notes. I do want to highlight just a couple. Baxter has a dedicated website. The most up-to-date information will be there. For Vizient members, we have our product disruption brief. The FDA has a website dedicated to this Baxter facility, and it's a great resource, a great reference to consider anything that you might not have done yet that you can now with these drugs being listed as shortages per FDA.
Thanks, Kyle, for all those resources. And like you said, we'll go ahead and list them in the show notes and link out so our listeners can access those resources. I really appreciate both of you joining today for this important podcast. I learned a lot. There was also a lot of information for our listeners. I want to give each of you an opportunity to have a concluding remark. What do you think is the most important thing to emphasize to our listeners as they continue to handle this fluid shortage?
Conservation is key. Number one, taking action now, taking a moment to assess your overall supply assurance strategy. Are you really leveraging the opportunities and the solutions that are available to you today in other categories? Don't let a crisis be the reason why you decide to implement a strategy. Be proactive, get a strategy implemented today. We have a lot of resources and support. My whole team here at Vizient can support any of our providers. I would highlight those two areas, conserve and start to think about your assurance strategy.
I echo the same. It's conserve today, and then once this is done, hopefully in the next couple of weeks or months, have that debrief session to understand what you may need to do better or more completely in the future so that you are better equipped to handle and manage all of the unknowns in the supply chain today.
Thank you so much, Katie and Kyle, for joining the Verified RX podcast today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And listeners, Please join us for more Verified RX podcasts. Subscribe today, like us, and send us your comments. We'd love to hear from you. Verified RX is your prescription for success and is brought to you by the Vizient Center for Pharmacy Practice Excellence. I'm Gretchen Brummel. Thanks for listening.